The West is in decline. Dedicated people who have studied certain factors can now visualize and therefore articulate it. And because none of this information can be used to inspire you to spend or vote in a way that helps the elite, your favorite news channel won't even talk about it.
We know more than ever before, but who knew bias was the bane of all you study? We know more than ever before, but who knew bias was the bane of all you study?
Stephen J. Shaw's population crisis documentary Birthgap was released in February 2023. The first hour of it is available right here on YouTube. Because of the YouTube algorithm, it made it onto my radar instantly. And the fact that this documentary hasn't spread like wildfire through our culture tells you everything you need to know about big data and what we're allowed to see. This while corporations sell us their fantasies that we can't afford, and political parties sell us candidates that we can't trust. The first hour of Birthgap is largely an explanation of the premise, to include the debunking of some commonly held views.
To 8, and then it goes up to 9, and then it goes here. But see, it's slowing down. By the end of the century, it's becoming more flat there. And if I do...
No one could explain population trends better than the late Hans Rosling, including why our total headcount will increase for a while, despite the number of children having peaked.
Now, this will confuse you, because how can then the total population grow like this if the children doesn't increase? Where will all these adults come from?
And Japan are fast becoming inverted worlds with too many retirees for their shrinking workforces to support. Then, if we look at the number of newborns who, in around 20 years' time, will be entering the workforce to support these retirees, they're less than half. Any large gap between the number of newborns and the number of people they will have to support into retirement is significant socially and economically. Given that these gaps are being caused by long-term low birth rates, I decided to call any shortfall in workers birth gaps. First, I colored any regions that did have more babies than 50-year-olds green. But in regions where there were too few children being born, I used increasingly dark shades of red, with the darkest red meaning there are less than half the number of babies being born compared to the older people they would need to support. And at the center of any region with a birth gap, I put a gaping black hole proportional to the drop in the number of children. While this trend only affected parts of Europe 50 years ago, by the 1990s, birth gaps had spread to every corner of the continent. Even Scandinavia, a region known for its gender equality and parental benefits, wasn't immune. In Denmark, a country that offers 1 year paid leave and free education, the birth gap had reached 30%. There had even been a campaign. Do it for Denmark.
Kan sex redde Danmarks fremtid? Danmark har et problem, og der fødes ikke nok børn til at forsørge den aldrende befolkning. Skiftende regeringer har ikke kunne løse problemet, men der må være en løsning. Do it for Denmark.
But it's not only Denmark in this coveted part of the world. In 2019, Erna Solberg, Prime Minister of Norway, became the first global leader to address her people on the birth gap crisis.
Norge trenger flere barn. Vi nordmenn får stadig færre barn. For å opprettholde folketallet må hver av oss kvinner få litt mer enn 2 barn i gjennomsnitt. I dag er tallet 1,6. Da blir det relativt sett færre unge som skal bære en stadig tyngre velferdsstat på sine skuldre.
But with all the information the first hour of Birthgap presents, it hesitates to identify a cause, at least explicitly. Though the documentary suggests that population decline is a form of social change.
Population decline is a form of social change.
The documentary dances around exactly what changes are fueling Shaw's birth gap. I'm going to jump to the end here. we are to draw the conclusion that the Western economy is unsustainable for population growth.
You want to educate yourself, you want to find the right partner, you want to have fun. So it seems that the time is never right.
I think. I think in Japan, marry means end of life for the humans.
Hell no. Hell to the no. I'm not ready to have kids.
I've always thought about having kids. I'm also not in a place where I'm like married or pregnant or thinking about getting pregnant. So maybe in a few years that'll be another discussion.
All of my friends are head down into their career. None of them are married and none of them have kids. Everybody's just career driven. So I feel so much pressure from my family and Kenny's family. They're constantly asking us, when are you going to have kids? And just trying to explain to them, like, I just really want to establish my career first.
I'm still very much focused on, like, getting at a certain place in my career before thinking of, like, my brain cannot even think about that.
I watched the Birthgap documentary, and these are my demands. I want an unlimited supply of Poppy, specifically Doc Pop. I don't want to pay for any of the baby's supplies, free child care, unless you just want to pay me a bunch of money and then I don't have to work. Let's do that actually. Unlimited access to a vineyard, a Tesla, and then I get to meet Frank Ocean. And I'll have a kid. I'll do it. Pick one for the team.
So I watched the Birthgap documentary, and these are my demands. I want an unlimited supply of Poppy, specifically Doc Pop. I don't want to pay for any of the baby's supplies, free child care, unless you just want to pay me a bunch of money and then I don't have to work. Let's do that actually. Unlimited access to a vineyard, a Tesla.
When the women you just saw were in grade school, the increase of the American cost of living over the decades was addressed by the excellent 2008 documentary End of the Road: How Money Became Worthless.
The inflation rate. In many measures of a standard of living, Americans today are actually worse off. You can take my grandparents. My grandmother never worked, despite the fact that my grandfather was a carpenter, and they had 8 children. Could a carpenter, somebody without even a high school diploma, just working in a blue-collar job, support a wife and 8 kids today? Not a chance.
With inflation rising faster than incomes, people were forced into more and more drastic measures to maintain their standard of living.
With each new day, the work of a family begins again.
When we went off gold backing of the dollar, what used to happen prior to that is the husband went to work, the wife stayed at home, raised the family. Because of inflation in the 70s, the wife went to work. So now you had 2 incomes that were necessary to produce and buy the same goods and services. In the 90s, we stopped saving. The savings rate basically got down to 0 because people were spending. They couldn't save in order to buy the same goods and services. Then we got to the last decade. The wife was already working. The savings were down to 0. They borrowed money. And so we've gone from 2 earners getting rid of our savings rate to borrowing money to keep pace with inflation.
The average person is now forced to borrow well beyond their means, getting themselves deeply into debt. At first, this was to maintain a nice standard of living, but slowly, it has become necessary just to survive. By printing so much currency.
Now, by Western economy, I mean the interest-centric, money creation through debt, inflation-generating system instituted by the world's 7 central banks. This, with the United States Central Bank being the privately owned and oddly named Federal Reserve Bank of the United States.
So what is a central bank? A central bank is an institution that issues and regulates the currency of an entire nation. Based on historical precedent, the typical powers inherent in central banking practice include the control of interest rates, and the expansion and contraction of the money supply itself. Now, the central bank does not simply issue money to the government, it loans it to them with interest. Then, through the mechanisms of increasing and decreasing the supply of money, the central bank essentially regulates the value of the currency issued. It is critical to understand that the entire structure of this system could only produce one thing in the long run: debt. It doesn't take a lot of ingenuity to figure this scam out. For every single dollar produced by both the central bank and its regulated commercial banks is loaned at interest. That means every dollar produced is actually the dollar plus a certain percentage of debt based on that dollar. And since the banking system has the monopoly of the production of the currency, and they loan each dollar out with an immediate debt attached to it, where does the money to pay for the debt come from? It can only come from the banks again, which means the banking system has to perpetually increase its money supply to temporarily cover the outstanding debt created, which, in turn, since that new money is loaned out at interest as well, creates even more debt. The end result of this system is essentially slavery, for it is technically impossible for the government and thus the public to ever come out of the self-generating debt. A number of years ago, the Central Bank of the United States, the Federal Reserve, produced a document entitled Modern Money Mechanics. This publication detailed the institutionalized practice of money creation as utilized by the Federal Reserve and the web of global commercial banks it supports. On the opening page, the document states its objective. The purpose of this booklet is to describe the basic process of money creation in a fractional reserve banking system. It then proceeds to describe this fractional reserve process through various banking terminology, a translation of which goes something like this. The United States government decides it needs some money, so it calls up the Federal Reserve and requests, say, $10 billion. The Fed replies, saying, sure, we'll buy $10 billion in government bonds from you. So the government takes some pieces of paper, paints some official-looking designs on them, and calls them treasury bonds. Then it puts a value on these bonds to the sum of $10 billion and sends them over to the Fed. In turn, the people at the Fed draw up a bunch of impressive pieces of paper themselves, only this time calling them Federal Reserve notes, also designating a value of $10 billion to the set. The Fed then takes these notes and trades them for the bonds. Once this exchange is complete, the government then takes the $10 billion in Federal Reserve notes and deposits it into a bank account. And upon this deposit, the paper notes officially become legal tender money, adding $10 billion to the U.S. money supply. And there it is. $10 billion in new money has been created. Of course, this example is a generalization, for, in reality, this transaction would occur electronically, with no paper used at all. In fact, only 3% of the U.S. money supply exists in physical currency. The other 97% essentially exists in computers alone. Now, government bonds are, by design, instruments of debt. And when the Fed purchases these bonds, with money it essentially created out of thin air, the government is actually promising to pay back that money to the Fed. In other words, the money was created out of debt. This mind-numbing paradox of how money or value can be created out of debt or a liability will become more clear as we further this exercise. So, the exchange has been made and now $10 billion sits in a commercial bank account. Here's where it gets really interesting. For as based on the fractional reserve practice, that $10 billion deposit instantly becomes part of the bank's reserves, just as all deposits do. And regarding reserve requirements, as stated in modern money mechanics, a bank must maintain legally required reserves equal to a prescribed percentage of its deposits. It then quantifies this by stating, under current regulations, the reserve requirement against most transaction accounts is 10%. This means that with a $10 billion deposit, 10% or $1 billion is held as the required reserve, while the other $9 billion is considered an excessive reserve and can be used as the basis for new loans. Now, it is logical to assume that this $9 billion is literally coming out of the existing $10 billion deposit. However, this is actually not the case. What really happens is that the $9 billion is simply created out of thin air on top of the existing $10 billion deposit. This is how the money supply is expanded. As stated in modern money mechanics, of course they, the banks, do not really pay out loans from the money they receive as deposits. If they did this, no additional money would be created. What they do when they make loans is to accept promissory notes, loan contracts, in exchange for credits money to the borrower's transaction accounts. In other words, the $9 billion can be created out of nothing simply because there is a demand for such a loan and that there is a $10 billion deposit to satisfy the reserve requirements. Now, let's assume that somebody walks into this bank and borrows the newly available $9 billion. They will then most likely take that money and deposit it into their own bank account. The process then repeats, for that deposit becomes part of the bank's reserves. 10% is isolated, and in turn 90% of the $9 billion, or $8.1 billion, is now available as newly created money for more loans. And of course, that 8.1 can be loaned out and redeposited, creating an additional 7.2 billion to 6.5 billion to 5.9 billion, etc. This deposit money creation loan cycle can technically go on to infinity. The average mathematical result is that about $90 billion can be created on top of the original $10 billion. In other words, for every deposit that ever occurs in the banking system, about 9 times that amount can be created out of thin air.
Money jitters? Ask the obliging Bank of America for a jar of soothing instant money, M-O-N-E-Y, in the form of a convenient personal loan.
So, now that we understand how money is created by this fractional reserve banking system, a logical yet elusive question might come to mind. What is actually giving this newly created money value? The answer? The money that already exists. The new money essentially steals value from the existing money supply. For the total pool of money is being increased irrespective to demand for goods and services. And as supply and demand finds equilibrium, prices rise, diminishing the purchasing power of each individual dollar. This is generally referred to as inflation, and inflation is essentially a hidden tax on the public.
What is the advice that you generally get? And that is inflate the currency. They don't say debase the currency. They don't say devalue the currency. They don't say cheat the people who are saved. They say lower the interest rates. The real deception is when we distort the value of money. When we create money out of thin air, we have no savings, and yet there's so-called capital. So my question boils down to this: how in the world can we expect to solve the problems of inflation, that is, the increase in the supply of money, with more inflation?
Of course, it can't. The fractional reserve system of monetary expansion is inherently inflationary. For the act of expanding the money supply, without there being a proportional expansion of goods and services in the economy, will always debase a currency. In fact, a quick glance at the historical values of the US dollar versus the money supply reflects this point definitively, for the inverse relationship is obvious. $1 in 1913 required $21.60 in 2007 to match value. That is a 96% devaluation since the Federal Reserve came into existence. It's available in circulation. This is why inflation is a constant in the economy, for new money is always needed to help cover the perpetual deficit built into the system, caused by the need to pay the interest. What this also means is that mathematically, defaults and bankruptcy are literally built into the system, and there will always be poor pockets of society that get the short end of the stick. An analogy would be a game of musical chairs, for once the music stops, somebody is left out to dry. And that's the point. It invariably transfers.
Now, I've been referencing these late 2000s documentaries ever since they came out. It would seem, however, that some of this information has finally trickled down to younger generations.
Can somebody explain to me in crayon-eating terms why I make over 3 times the federal minimum wage and I cannot afford to live? And I do not want to hear the pull yourself up from your bootstraps, work 90 hours a week. That's not the goal, guys. That's not. That should not be our standard. I am so fucking tired of people being complacent with this uniparty, both of them fucking us over. When my parents were my age, they both made less than half of what I make, and they lived alone. I cannot afford to live anywhere alone. A 1-bedroom apartment, $1,800. 2-bedroom apartment, $2,200. Who the fuck can afford that? It is embarrassing to come out and say that it is a struggle to survive right now, but I know so many people are struggling. And do not get me started on what my grandparents were doing. They, $3,000 house. And yes, I understand inflation and all of the bullshit that they have been pulling with the Fed. Why are we allowing it? Why? And then I clock out of my shift. I am tired. I have to go home. And I check the news. Another 60 fucking billion to a country nobody can point out on a map. What are we doing? Where has the plot gone? We have lost it, folks. We have fucking lost it. The American dream is dead. It is over. Gone and forgotten.
I'll do you one better, young man. The American dream was, 1, never afforded to everyone at any given point in the country's history, and 2, was never sustainable. Those two facts are related, by the way. Behind every great fortune is a great crime. Think about it. It doesn't take that much imagination. This young man also mentioned foreign aid. Foreign aid is talked about, not just on the news, but morning shows and afternoon talk shows. Those programs love to show things from the internet. But nobody wanted to play this TikTok from this desperate young man who represents so many in the country? The homeless is only mentioned if the story can be leveraged against political rivals. And of course, people still care what the privileged are doing with their time and their money.
There are so many girls that are looking at you now going, I want to be like Taylor Swift. I want to do what she's doing. I think she's so cool. When did you have that time that you didn't feel so great?
I don't feel great when I am fed messages, and when I was fed messages as a young girl, that it's more important to be edgy.
This video is destined not to be seen by many people. But if you do see it, whoever you are, know one man's opinion. There is a cycle of civilization. And I believe that the Western world has entered the beginning of the dark section of that cycle. It's actually an old story. Decades ago, I wrote the lyrics for a song about it. The first stanza went a little something like this. Here's something everyone refuses to see, but it's something everybody already believes, that there's no real solution. It's just a cycle of oppression till revolution. I'm Odium. This has been Message in a Bottle. Like, subscribe, and come back for the next reflection.
But who knew bias was the bane of all you study? We know more than ever before. But who knew bias was the bane of all you study?